Hi, my name is Michelle Nicolaisen. In this video, I'll be discussing how to manage your own projects as a freelancer, including tips on communicating better with email, managing client feedback, and avoiding scope creep, which can totally kill your profit margin if you let it. Ready? All right, let's jump in. So the first thing we're going to talk about is avoiding scope creep. The definition of scope creep from Wikipedia is uncontrolled changes or continuous growth in a project's scope. This is generally considered to be a very bad thing. This is like when you get to what should be 75% of the way through the project, or even like 90%, and all of a sudden the client requests a bunch of changes and revisions and additions to deliverables, and that means that you're really only like halfway done with the project. This is especially bad if you charge project fees, or if you charge like per deliverable. So if you get paid based on the website, or based on the amount of apps that you deliver, or if you're just getting paid for like the whole project, then this is really, really bad because it cuts into your profit margins, and it can wind up making you get a really, really low hourly fee from that particular project. It's still bad even if you're charging hourly. It might not have the same monetary effect, but for example, if you told client B that you would be able to start on their work on this date, and then the project for client A takes so long that you have to push back that date, that can wind up making client B irritated. It can wind up making them go find another person. And so this is generally just a very bad thing. One of the ways that you can make sure you avoid scope creep is by clearly defining not just your objectives, and your objectives are the goal of the project, which can be nebulous, but the specific outcomes and the deliverables that you'll be working on during a kickoff meeting with the client. So a lot of times, especially if you're working with bigger businesses or larger teams, they'll have project objectives like make a more on-brand website or something like that. And that's really not very concrete. So what you want to be getting out of this kickoff meeting is like, okay, I will deliver to you one wireframe, like 3 mock-ups, 2 rounds of revisions, and the final product coded according to these specifications with 1 week of tech support follow-up. Like, that's what you need to nail out at the very beginning of the project, because if you don't, it will come back and bite you later. And you really, 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 really need to get those outcomes and deliverables in writing, because people's memories are notoriously unreliable. People forget things or they misremember them, and you need to have it in writing, even if it's just an email. Even if you just email them after the meeting and are like, hey, I just want to make sure we're on the same page, and so that you sign off on these deliverables. Here's what I've got. Please just reply to this email, confirm that you've received it and that you agree. Something like that can save you so much time and energy and effort later in the project, because they can't like add things on without paying you extra, or without at least acknowledging that they shouldn't be adding those things on. Another thing that you can do here is make sure you know the priorities and what can be cut if it has to be. So if you're working on a new app, make sure that you know the priorities in the feature set, so that if like coding in 3 of these features takes so much longer than you thought it would, or than they thought it would, than anyone thought it would, then you know that you can cut features 4 and 5, and you can still get the product to market, and those features can be added in a later version, or in another round with the client. So making sure that you know the priorities and what can be cut if it has to be can help you avoid scope creep as well. Another thing that you can do that's really helpful is having communication turnaround guidelines and laying them out, again, in writing at the beginning of the project and before you start the work. So, for example, I always tell clients that Tuesday through Thursday are my work days, and that if I send something to them on Tuesday and I don't hear back until Thursday evening, that I am not going to be able to take into account those revision requests until next Tuesday. So telling people, I expect turnaround time within this many days or this many hours while we're working on this project. Otherwise, I might have to go ahead without approval or put the project on hold, something like that. And making sure that these expectations are super clear. Like I said, you have them in writing, like you send this via an email, you tell them like your client guidelines, things like that. That can really save you too, because one of the things that causes scope creep is that people will take like 5 days to respond to an email. So, you make a change and then you have to get approval for it, and then you wait sitting on your hands for like 5 days not knowing when you're going to hear back from them, and like if you should plan on dropping everything and working on this project on this day or this day or this day. And so yeah, that's a really good way to help avoid scope creep, is by having communication turnaround guidelines. And of course, you want to write into your contract that there are fees. There is a fee if the project stretches out too long due to something on their end. This is especially important if you charge per project. It's totally worth it to pay a lawyer to draw something up, or even to pay something like LegalZoom, a database like that. It's totally worth it to make sure that you have an airtight contract that says, like, if we go past 3 rounds of revisions, then additional revisions will be charged at blank an hour or blank per revision. If I go a week without hearing from you and then you pop back up and request more revisions, then those revisions will be charged differently. You know, things like that. You want to get all of that in your contract, and you want to get it in writing, and you want to get it signed. And that will really help, because one of the things is that clients, sometimes the issue here is clients just don't see any consequences to causing scope creep. So you need to make them aware that there are very real consequences in your business if this project is going to stretch out, and make it an undesirable outcome for them. In the last episode, we talked about managing feedback. So this is a big part of keeping projects on track too. One of the things that you can do here is minimizing the project stakeholders, the people who can give their stamp of approval, the people who are like really inputting on this project. Less stakeholders generally means less feedback. There is some sort of balance you want to have here, because like we talked about during the lean video, it's totally possible for you to wind up with like only one person who can approve everything or who is giving you feedback. And if every part of the project relies on them, then that's a big bottleneck. So generally what you want to do here is try and avoid having to wait for feedback from like 15 people, things like that. And similarly, you want to avoid death by committee syndrome, which goes hand in hand with minimizing the stakeholders. We've all worked on those projects where you send something to the client and then every single person weighs in and none of them can decide on what they want, and like you have to wait while they argue it out internally for 2 weeks, and you just really want to not have that happen. Another way you can manage feedback is getting all of the feedback at once before implementing. So a big mistake that freelancers make is if they have to wait for feedback from like 3 people, then they'll send it to all of them. They'll get feedback from person number 1 and they go and make those changes. And then person number 2 has some extra feedback on top of that, but also person number 2 wants you to change some of the things that you changed to make person number 1 happier. So if you change things after each round of feedback, like after each person's feedback, instead of waiting for all of it to come in at once, then you can cause a lot of unnecessary stress and spend a lot of extra time on it. And then you want to repeat and summarize the feedback back to the client before you implement. So what this looks like in practice, what all this looks like in practice would be aiming to have like 3 people, like 3 people would probably be ideal. Sometimes you're going to deal with more than that, but it's something to keep in mind when you're setting project rates, that the more stakeholders there are, generally the longer this is going to take, the longer the project's going to take. But so let's say you have 3 people, they're really good about not arguing, so you don't have to worry too much about death by committee syndrome. But every time you send something to them, you wait for all 3 of them to weigh in, and then you repeat it back to them and say, okay, so this is what John said, and this is what I'm going to do because of that. This is what Joe said. This is what I'm going to do because of that. Here's what Susie said, and here's what I'm going to do because of that. Altogether, what I heard is that I should make these changes on the project, and I can do that tomorrow. Can you just send me a quick email confirming that this is correct? And so it is gonna take a little bit more email time, but it will save you a lot of time, because once you repeat it back to them, what you heard might not have been what the client intended. We have all been in conversations where that was the case, and you don't want that to happen when your time and your effort and your money is involved. So one specific thing we're going to hone in on here is effective email communication. You want to ask better questions when you have to ask them via email. So, and you also want to prevent more emails and more questions by providing answers and solutions for various possibilities. So saying like if then, so for example, when you're writing back and clarifying that feedback, or like say someone's asking about working with you, you say, okay, if you wanted to do this kind of project, then I have availability starting this date. If you wanted to do that kind of project, I have availability starting this date. I wasn't quite sure which one you wanted from the email, so I thought I'd send you both. You also want to have email office hours. So no email on weekends, no email after 6 p.m., things like that. There's a lot to cover here, and I highly recommend that you check out this article, which I am going to show you, because it covers all of this sort of in practice. So it's at ndoherty.com/effective email communication with a hyphen between all of it. He says to number your points, cut out the soft questions, do if-then statements, as we already talked about, empathize, offer solutions instead of asking questions, and check email just once or twice a day. So there's more here. He's got an example, and you can see this email is super long, and this email is easy to skim, it's numbered, and it has answers. So definitely check out that article to learn more about effective email communication, because that's a big part of communicating effectively and of managing feedback. Make sure you leave time for administrative work and business development in your business. You need to account for the pre-project work and the post-project work. This includes things like client onboarding, consultations if you do consultations before you take on a client or take on a project, pitching, invoicing, email, and so on. So you need to account for this when you're making time estimates and when you're giving people potential rates. If you're on someone else's team, then you aren't doing all of this, but running your own business, you have to. So don't forget the work around the work when you start a new project, or when you're tasking things out or managing projects or giving time estimates or anything like that. You can't forget this stuff, or you will shoot yourself in the foot. Okay, to recap, you want to prevent scope creep with outcome and deliverable lists, communication guidelines, and priorities. You want to always get everything in writing. You want to manage the feedback by getting it all before implementing and then repeating it back to the client before you implement to make sure you're both on the same page. You want to work on improving your email communication using the tips from that article and the tips from that part of the slide. And you want to make sure that you are taking the time and the energy to account for administrative work and business development work into account in your business. I hope you enjoyed the lesson on managing your projects as a freelancer. If you want to learn more about project management and what it can do for your freelance business, make sure to come check out the Project Management for Freelance Developers course right here on Learnable. I hope to see you there.